Welcome, everyone. I can see participants are just trickling in, so we'll wait a few moments before we get started. Okay, well, let's get started. Welcome to our panel discussion on the Pakistan floods, climate change, food security, and gender justice as part of the Peace and Reconciliation Center's Peace Talk series. This event is being held to mark Canada's International Development Week, held each year to spotlight Canada's role and responsibility to contribute to peace, the eradication of poverty, and an inclusive world. This year's theme is Go for the Goals, referring to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and in particular, food security, climate action, health, education, and gender equality. I'm Geetanjali Gill, a commitment leader at the Peace and Reconciliation Center at the University of the Fraser Valley, and I'm an assistant professor in the Global Development Studies program. I'd like to welcome our three panelists and the audience on behalf of PARC's director, Keith Carlson, my commitment leaders, and PARC's steering committee. I'm moderating this event today from the unceded territory of the Musqueam people in Vancouver. I'd also like to acknowledge and express gratitude for working and learning on Stolo territories at the University of the Fraser Valley. For those of you joining us from other regions, please acknowledge the lands upon which you are living and working. And let's all think about the historical and current oppressions facing Indigenous and marginalized communities around the world. This panel discussion will also direct our thoughts to the disproportionate impact that climate change can have on groups of people who are least able to cope. The 2022 floods in Pakistan resulted in over 1/3 of the country being flooded, millions of people being displaced, and thousands losing their lives. These regions of the country continue to suffer from continued threats to food security and health. In the Fraser Valley, BC, with our own experiences of floods in 2021, we understand how devastating the loss of land and livelihoods can be. Let's take a moment of silence to think about the victims and survivors of the devastating floods that occurred in Pakistan in 2022. And I'm certain that we are all also thinking about the very large number of people who have been affected by the earthquake that occurred in Turkey and Syria only a few days ago. So if we can take a few moments of silence. Thank you. Join me in welcoming our panelists, each of whom are carrying out inspiring work. Each panelist will address specific dimensions of climate change, impacts, and responses in Pakistan. And they will each speak in turn, and we will also have time for a Q&A session. Please, you can type your questions for the panelists into the Q&A box at any time. And please don't use the chat box. We'll be looking primarily at the Q&A box. This event is being recorded and it will be available for viewing shortly after the event on the PARC website for the university. I would like to turn to Isbah first. Isbah Hameed has an MPhil in environmental policy from the Lahore School of Economics in Pakistan. She's currently pursuing her doctorate degree from the International Institute of Social Studies, Erasmus University, Rotterdam in the Netherlands, where she's also a member of the Political Ecology Research Group. Her research interests lie in adaptation strategies for climate change in Pakistan, and she's primarily looking at the viability of adaptation strategies in the agriculture sector in Pakistan and how climate policies intervene and interact at the interface with the agriculture sector. Isbah also teaches courses on climate change and environmental policy at a public sector university in Pakistan. I'm just going to spotlight Isbah. Sure. One moment here. Okay, Isbah, are you able to tell us a bit more about the role of climate change in causing floods in Pakistan and what you see as the limitations of the current or planned adaptation strategies in the wake of the floods? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Geetanjali. In the beginning, I would like to say thanks to you for organizing this event, and I'm really honored and pleased to speak as a part of this panel alongside very veteran Ms. Farrah and Areebah in their respective fields. So thank you so much for organizing this event altogether. As part of this panel, I would like to speak about particularly I would like to speak about the role of climate change in causing this, the recent disaster that Pakistan has experienced last year. And most importantly, I would like to take my discussion towards the viability of the adaptation measures that Pakistan as a state and as the institutions that they are taking adaptation strategies to mitigate or to respond to disasters of such scales. But before going into these two things, I would like to sketch a little bit of the historical background because it is important to understand this disaster in perspective. So I would like to sketch a little bit of historical background that how Pakistan and floods are interconnecting with each other. So Pakistan geographically is lying in an area which is geographically it is a low inundating plain. And in the last 75 years of independence, what we have seen is that almost 28 to 30 major riverine floods we have experienced in the last 75 years. So that shows that almost every 2 to 3 years, we experience a massive disastrous flood of varying intensity and also in varying intensity with varying geographical regions. But most importantly, it is the river Indus Basin which is most importantly impacted by the by this flood disaster. There are two important things. One is the geography and the other is the seasonal impact also, because Pakistan receives monsoon rainfall and 70% of the rainfall is actually 70% of the rainfall, annual rainfall happens in the monsoon season. So this is very important to realize that how significant the historical background is, that how the floods are connected with the Pakistan's geographically and seasonally. But I mean, one of the important things that I want to highlight over here is that despite such a deep likelihood of floods and deep vulnerability for these disasters, it is very unfortunate that still Pakistan lacks a comprehensive emergency response that could affect or systematically respond to to this disaster. I've missed my screen. So, okay. So one of the important things is that Pakistan still lacks a comprehensive emergency response. Another important thing is that one of the reasons that they gave is that the government in the Pakistan changes very frequently, but I think it depends upon the policies and the role and the policies that are being made for the people. So the lack of commitment, lack of political will that revolves around how the policies are to be made in order to mitigate disasters or in order to respond to the disasters is still lacking. So we shall come back to this point in a bit, but once we shall also discuss a little bit about the recent disaster that has happened last year. The flood disaster that has happened last year was not exclusive in terms of its occurrence, because we already know that floods are likely to occur every few years in this region in the country, but it was an exclusive event in terms of its scale and its magnitude. And it was disastrous. It was an unprecedented event, and we received 3 times more rainfall, and that was an overwhelming situation that had happened because it was not only the rainfall, but it was also the urban flash floods in urban centers, and it was also the glacier melt, and altogether in the upper northern parts of the country, and altogether what has happened, altogether it inundated almost 1/3 part of the country underwater. And around 1,500 people were died, and almost 33 million people had got impacted. and had to be displaced from their regions. So that shows how disastrous, how massive that overall rainfall, and that has turned into a disaster, into a crisis in a few days. So basically, there are various reasons that are being supposed, that are being given for this massive disaster. Climate change is being associated, that is one of the reasons. Besides climate change, I mean, we will also talk about, I will also like to draw the attention towards the physical and the social vulnerability of the system. But climate change is one of the most important reason that lies over here. And it is important to say that though we have a long history of floods in Pakistan, but this disaster was exclusive in terms of its scale and intensity and its magnitude. And what we have already seen, and what we have already through the research articles, we have found that the South Asia is becoming more vulnerable to these kinds of meteorological disasters, and it is becoming more arid during dry seasons, and it is also getting wetter during these monsoon seasons. So just in the Arabian Sea, if we look at the data from the 1880s to the present, that indicates that in the past decades, the frequency of the meteorological events have got increased manifold. So similarly, the rainfall patterns, the cyclonic events, the droughts, so they have increased significantly. Climate change is also one of the reasons for this disaster, because it is directly linked to the warming pattern in the Arabian Sea. What we have observed and what is being reported through research articles is that the Arabian Sea is showing a warming pattern which is much more faster than the warming trends all over the other oceans. So the warming pattern that the Arabian Sea is showing is 1 degree Celsius warming pattern, that is exclusively more than 0.7 degrees Celsius warming in the other oceans of the world. So that is actually playing a very critical role in intensifying the monsoon system. And this intensification of the monsoon system was also triggered by the heat waves in June and May in the previous months before this monsoon started. So climate change does have a role in causing this disaster, in causing this crisis. But one of the things that is being talked about is that the vulnerability of the communities, the vulnerability of the region, that also plays a very important role in the overall losses and in the overall damage that we have experienced in this disaster. Something which is linked with the social and economic vulnerability is that the unplanned urbanization, the role of the role of the development policies, inappropriate development policies, increasing economic and social vulnerability of the people and pushing these people towards the margin areas, to the ecologically sensitive areas to be settled. So altogether, these physical and social and political policies are also playing a significant role in the damage and the losses that Pakistan has experienced last year. So we cannot just blame just the climate change, but obviously there is an underlying role of the policies, of the economic and social policies, that are also playing their part significantly. Interestingly, what has happened towards the end of this disaster is a very interesting debate was initiated between Pakistan, between the state and the state institutions, in Pakistan and the international community. So it was a kind of pointing fingers towards each other, because the people and the state institutions from Pakistan was making responsible the international community for causing this disaster, which is actually right in a way, because they do bear an historical responsibility of emitting greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and creating climate crisis that we are experiencing today. On the other hand, the international community was pointing fingers towards Pakistan, because they were saying that, look at your own self, what you have done in the last 75 years. You haven't been able to build a comprehensive emergency response system, a disaster management plan in place. There is no disaster management plan in place. So, so at one point, I mean, it becomes very annoying that rather than accepting your own responsibilities, rather than taking the responsibilities and admitting that what have been going wrong on both sides, both of the parties were pointing fingers against each other. Anyhow, that was culminated in loss in the COP27 in Egypt, and somehow one of the things that was being decided was loss and damage for the vulnerable countries. That was kind of the financial liability to be fulfilled by the international communities for the vulnerable communities who will be get affected by such kind of disasters. So that was one of the things, that how we do understand the role of the climate change, because we have practically experienced that how the seasons are getting altered. We experience the monsoon pattern is being accentuated in some parts, and we are experiencing the droughts in other parts of the region. But alongside, we also know that how the physical and the social and political policies play their own part in increasing the vulnerability of the region towards such kind of disasters. So I think both are equally responsible, and they cannot absolve themselves from their own responsibilities by just pointing fingers against each other. So both the parties need to take the responsibility and do what they can do at their own places. So this is how we can somehow find a middle space where something can be done in order to prevent such kind of disasters for future. Now coming to the role of the adaptation strategies, I mean, what the state or the states is planning to prevent themselves from the disasters of such scale. I find it interesting. I mean, this disaster, I think, is an illuminating case, not only for Pakistan, but for the whole world, because this has shown us, this disaster has shown us that climate change can surprise you in many ways. Climate change can surprise us in ways more than what we have already experienced, in ways more than what we can anticipate through these sophisticated forecasting models. I mean, adaptation is a moving target, and no one cannot anticipate exactly how the situation is going to be worsened in the future. It can get worse, it can get better. I mean, so this is not better, but it can be less worsened as we can anticipate. So this is a very situation where we can't decide exactly what should we do in terms of the adaptation. But adaptation, as we know, that this is one of the most possible ways in which the international the community is asking the regions and the countries to go for taking some measures to prevent themselves or to protect themselves from the disasters of such scale. But this disaster was iconic in the sense that the conventional way we are trying to address the disasters is not going to help us. This was iconic in the way that the conventional development pathways, the conventional strategic adaptation measures that we are going to that we have been taking in previously in order to prevent ourselves from the disasters is not going to be effective anymore. What we have seen in these disasters, I'll just quote some examples here, that the river embankments were destroyed, and from Balochistan, we have received various news that how some around 80 or more than 80 dams were actually demolished. There could be several reasons for the demolition of these dams. It could be that the dams could not bear the pressure of such kind of floods of the water, so much water. On the other hand, we have also observed that these dams have also been used as a tool, as a political tool to wield power, and to divert the ways of the flood water towards the marginal communities. So dams have a very controversial, role in order to protect themselves, in order to protect the communities from from disasters or from the flood disaster in particular. So, and now we have also seen that there is an exceeding research that is going on, that how dams are not sufficient enough to protect the communities from floods. These embankments, river embankments, these dams, these structural infrastructure, water infrastructure was built in Indus River Basin, was initially built to protect the communities from the floods. But now what we are seeing is that the same strategies are going to be proved more disastrous rather than helpful. So the states, the way the state is looking at how we can protect themselves or protect ourselves from the disaster is, I think this disaster has given us a case study, not only for Pakistan, but for the whole world, that we really need to rethink our adaptation strategies. We really need to rethink our developmental strategies, because we need to set our priorities right now. We can't predict what is going to happen in the next coming years. So we really don't know what intensity or what kind of magnitude the events in the future will bring. So we need to work on two ways. We need to rearrange the developmental priorities. We need to rearrange the social and political priorities, and we need to rearrange the responsibility that the international community has in mitigating climate change. So altogether, basically, I think that the conventional ways in which the disasters have been tackling so far are not going to be proven any useful in this disaster and in the upcoming disasters in future. So beyond that, how much time do I have?
You can wrap up. It's at 15 minutes now. Yeah. You can take another minute or so, Isbah.
Okay, so basically what I wanted to say is that it is not about only the climate change, because climate change does have a role. We have already seen that climate change is impacting the communities, that climate change is impacting the seasonal patterns, and it is impacting the agricultural patterns as well. But beyond that, we also need to work around the social and economic vulnerability of the communities as well, because this is the inappropriate policies that are pushing people towards the marginalized areas, and we need to rethink how we can strengthen the communities, how we can empower the communities so that they can take certain measures in order to adapt themselves. One of the things that I think can be done in order to protect ourselves from this disasters of such scale in future is that we need to empower the communities. We need to go back to the indigenous knowledge. We need to go back to the indigenous systems, where the rivers and the riverine plains were considered part of the life of the people. So it was not something that was coming from outside. So they use their indigenous knowledge, they use their indigenous systems to overcome the disasters of such scale. So without empowering communities, without strengthening the people, it is quite impossible that we can address this issue just through infrastructural or through technical measures. This is the point where I would like to leave here, that we need to rethink our priorities, we need to rethink our developmental and political priorities in total. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Isbah. We really look forward to speaking with you more in the Q&A section of the event. Thank you. Next, I would like to, sorry, I'm just trying to remove the spotlight here. Has it come off? Yes, okay. Next, I would like to introduce Farrah Naz, who is the country director in Pakistan for the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition or GAIN, which is an international NGO. Farrah's education background is in rural development, gender relations, and agrarian change. She has long-standing experience in development and humanitarian contexts, and she's worked with a number of international NGOs, as well as the United Nations. Apart from Pakistan, she's worked in Afghanistan, South Sudan, the Philippines, and Guinea. In all of her work, she engages in the promotion of the rights of women and girls, as well as working with organizations to promote the rights of persons with disabilities. I'm just going to spotlight you. There we go. Farrah, through your work at GAIN in Pakistan, could you tell us more about the impacts of the flooding, and in particular, the impacts of the floods on food security and nutrition? We'd also like to hear your views on how food systems resilience can be built and how nutrition outcomes can be improved or at least not deteriorated during crisis. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Geetanjali. I had prepared a few slides, so let me share my screen. I think I have the. Okay, just a minute. Trying to find the slides to share. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. And good afternoon, good evening, whoever is in whichever part of the time zone. We have, I would like to focus a little bit on food security and nutrition, and of course, then think about how we can transform our food system to adapt to climate change and to be more resilient in terms of meeting the needs of our people. So let me, I'm just going to. So this is the brief structure of my presentation, but I'll straight away go to the presentation. Actually, we just talked about the brief overview of losses in terms of the heavy rains and riverine and urban floods and flash flooding and unprecedented disaster. So many people being displaced, 8 million, around 8 million people displaced and 33 million people affected. And this was rain-induced floods, which accelerated, and Isbah has already talked about the glacial belt and landslides, which really devastated millions of homes and critical infrastructure. Keeping in view the food system, I have only focused on agriculture, food, livestock, and fisheries, water resources, and irrigation, and finance and the markets, because I thought that although other areas are also relevant, like, for example, infrastructure, roads, etc., because the whole urban food system really depends on the infrastructure and the supply chains being intact. So those are really, really important as well. But I thought that first, let's look at the losses and damages that happened to the agriculture, livestock, and fisheries. And these figures are in terms of billions of dollars. So this was in terms of the total losses. Total recovery needs actually are $16.3 billion. This was estimated through a study done by World Bank, post-disaster needs assessment by World Bank, and by some other agencies together who jointly did that. So keeping in view that, and when we look at the finance and markets, actually it does not include, it includes mostly the banks and the bank-related finances. It does not actually, it has not included any informal markets, fresh food markets, or any losses that happen to the small vendors in the informal markets. So those estimates are not included in here. The situation of food security and nutrition pre-floods was also very bad. As you can see that at national level, around 30% of the population experienced high level of acute or medium level of food insecurity, which is close to phase 3. And then this is according to the integrated food insecurity phase classification. And another 13% people are in the phase 4. And many of the flood affected areas fall either in phase 3 or in phase 4. So if we look at the districts that were affected by floods. Similarly, if you look at the nutrition, generally the 2018 Pakistan Nutrition Survey that looked at the people who are undernourished, 16.9%, and then percentage of population that was consuming all 5 foods was really low. It's 23% only, and people who could not afford healthy diets in 2020, and this I am referring to 2020 because all these the COVID, the impact of COVID, etc., also started to add at that time. Stunting in children, according to 2018, has been 40%, wasting 17.7%, and then a lot of micronutrient deficiencies, including iron, folic acid, vitamin B, vitamin A, all that, especially in the children, adolescents, and pregnant and lactating women. So if we look at the progress that Pakistan was making even before floods, prior to flood, it was very uneven. And if we look at all these indicators, all these indicators, childhood stunting, there had only been some progress. Similarly, childhood wasting, some progress, child overweight, and breastfeeding, little progress. The rest has been all off course in terms of our global nutrition targets that Pakistan is supposed to meet. If we look at the dietary diversity, this was a study conducted by GAIN in 2022. So in Pakistan, if you look at the highlighted ones on the left side of the screen, the sweetened drinks, tea, coffee, and cocoa, which is a risk factor, is actually quite high. Although the vegetable consumption is 70%, however, if we look at the dark green leafy vegetables and if we look at vitamin A rich vegetables, it's very low. The consumption is very low. And it is because of mostly the affordability of that. And after 6 months of flood, the situation still is not very good in Pakistan. Because recently when the wheat plantation season was going on, there are usually targets set by the government, and the government of Sindh said that they would not be able to meet more than 25% of their annual targets. Because most of the land in Sindh is still to be rehabilitated. Although there is no accurate data right now on the jobs, how many jobs were lost due to floods, and those who were self-employed, how much difficulty they had. But there was a small-scale study conducted by GAIN in one of the districts, and we found that small-scale vendors, fresh fruits and vegetables who have these, usually the wooden carts, and they at various places. They usually sell things on their carts. They have been very seriously being affected because in the beginning, the supply chain was not intact, and later on, they now do not have the cash to restart even the smallest level of their business. And for these small vendors, actually getting credit is also a very difficult thing to do. Similarly, recently, IRC International Rescue Committee, they had conducted a study and they found that only 15% of the respondents confirmed about the availability of nutrition supplement program for pregnant and lactating women in their respective areas, and they had conducted this study in 10 districts. And 16% of the household, of the surveyed household, mothers use traditional remedies for their children because the lactation is not sufficient, and 13% reported using packaged or powdered milk. 55% of the households were found with poor food consumption, and their IPC was in phase 4. And 31% of the households were on the borderline of the consumption of adequate diets, and with their IPC at phase 3. And only 14% of the households were with acceptable food consumption. And economic and human impact, so far, it is not fully clear that what medium-term or long-term economic impact is going to be. But however, some things that were worked out, that damages alone are 4.8% of the GDP, of 2022 GDP. And the aggregate impact is dependent on policy around response, early recovery, and rehabilitation. Impact can be reduced, however, through well-coordinated and adequately funded response, early recovery, and rehabilitation and reconstruction activities. However, the response plan is not fully funded. The revised plan is also only 1/8 of it is funded. So I'm talking about the UN plan that was presented. First, it was initially presented, and then in September, and then later on a revised plan was presented. Projected decline in agriculture output, in terms of the output, it's 0.9% of the FY22 GDP. It is projected. It's not the actual, but it is projected. And we will see actually next year how much how much production has been declined, and what is its share in the GDP. Similarly, industry added value to the agriculture, there is a projected decline of 0.7%. Similarly, all these things, when there is less output from agriculture and less value addition, then the wholesale and transportation also gets affected, and the jobs also get affected. We have already seen a lot of inflation, not only due to less food production available, but also due to other factors which are relevant to most other countries as well. And consumer price index, it has, there has been 26.9% increase in that. And prior to floods, also these calamity hit areas already suffered from a higher monetary and non-monetary poverty, and we can see that 21.9% in 2018-19, 21.9% of population lived below the poverty line, while rural was higher. And now the calamity hit districts, the projection is between 31.4 to 75%, depending on the areas. And out of the 25 poorest districts, 19 were the flood hit. Low productivity and limited resilience because of low resource areas is very clear. And so with these multiple factors involved, flood damages and losses, economic crisis, political uncertainty, this can create a very alarming situation for Pakistan. Some policy interventions that can be done in the medium term by the government immediately and the medium term are that if the financing needs are met, and if the online political uncertainties can be addressed and probable upcoming elections happen on time, and market confidence can be restored, only then the finances can come in, because in Pakistan, there are limited fiscal resources, and significant international support is required, which is not forthcoming as it was in 2010. So if we compare the floods of now with the 2010, in 2010, there was huge response, although the effects were smaller than this time, but there was huge response from international community, a lot of commitments came in, but this time it hasn't been to that extent. So government also need to put in tight controls and do a proper prioritization on use of resources, accelerate reforms to generate additional domestic fiscal resources. That has been a pressure already, and they need to do efficient targeting of the public spending. But apart from that, this was only to touch upon the policies, but a lot more needs to happen, which is in terms of, if we look at some of the ways of addressing such things, addressing the food system related resilience to protect people's nutrition, we need to have something that is called anticipatory emergency response. In certain countries, this has been found to be very helpful, that a flood is predictable. So before the floods, people were provided some support so that they could move to either safe places or they could buy their rations so they could sustain adequate diets. Similarly, we need to protect our food system workers, who are usually the most vulnerable segment of the society. These are very small farmers. These are also food processing workers. These are labor on various farms, etc., etc. So they need to be provided adequate support so that they can continue. They are free from thinking about their own survival, and they can continue to work in the sector that they are working. Similarly, strengthening the food markets infrastructure, and especially the informal small fresh food markets, which are very vulnerable to the disaster impact. And we also need to prevent food losses, both post-harvest and cooked and processed food losses, in order to have more available for people. When more quantities are available, are protected from losses available, then of course they will become more affordable as well. Similarly, protecting SMEs for affordable nutritious foods, promote diversity in production and consumption, including conserving the indigenous crops and trees, etc. Because trees and some of the vegetation is linked with also erosion, land erosion, as well as when the flash floods happen, how much mud comes with that. Dynamize and disaggregate food system data. Many a times in countries like Pakistan, adequate data around the food system indicators is not available, which is necessary to have readily available so that quick decisions can be made around that. And similarly, food systems are not just relevant in times of stability, they are much more relevant when there are disasters. And the ability to see the trade-offs and synergies and act holistically is even more valuable in the time of crisis. And that has been the coordination and the holistical view, and building back better is something that requires a lot more attention. And Isbah had already pointed out that early warning was one of the issues, the disaster management was, another management-related issue in managing disasters. Of course, coordination has been a major issue that we have seen here. So I would conclude by saying that at least Pakistan last year in the UN Food System Summit had already developed national pathways for food system transformation in Pakistan, which can lead to safe and nutritious food, which is a prerequisite for health. So they had identified 4 main areas essential for ensuring sustainable food system. One of those was sustainable agricultural practices, technology, and sustainable production system to meet food security, and then reduce food waste and crop losses, which I already mentioned in the other slide as well. Increase and ensure protection and preservation of prime agricultural land and combat desertification and drought. So this is not just preserving the prime agricultural land, also means that the rapid urbanization that is happening and the expansion of housing in the urban areas that is actually eroding the agricultural land, and the cities are expanding, that also needs to be addressed. Adoption of climate resilient techniques and measures for ensuring food security and sustainable agriculture. So at least, there is some thinking at the national level, which is already going into sustainable food systems and ensuring food security of people and adequate nutritious diets for all. Thank you very much. I'll stop sharing the screen.
Thank you so much, Farrah.
Thank you.
I'd now like to bring Areebah into our discussion. Areebah Shahid is currently the Executive Director of the Pakistan Youth Change Advocates. She has worked for more than 15 years as a development professional. She's also worked for 5 years as a broadcaster with Radio Pakistan. Areebah is a certified trainer in communications, advocacy, campaigning, and psychosocial first aid for children in emergency situations. She serves on the board of the Center for Peace and Development Initiatives, and she's also founded a youth-led magazine to provide a voice for young Pakistanis, bolojawan.com. Areebah has written extensively on the issues of gender-based violence and child rights. Areebah, we've heard, I'm just going to spotlight you as well here. Areebah, we've heard the slogan, no climate justice without gender justice, in many international conferences and workshops. Can you tell us what you think this means or should mean, and how this relates to climate change and the floods that have occurred in Pakistan? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Geetanjali, and thank you so much to the panelists, actually. It was really enlightening listening to all of you. And so it just makes me think that whatever it is that I have to say is quite clearly not going to be groundbreaking. But nonetheless, given your question, I will try to make as much sense as possible. So Geetanjali, when we're talking about climate justice, and I guess where I would like to start from is the fact that, in the development domain, when, certain words, they sort of, get picked up, they become buzzwords, and it's kind of cool to use them, right? But a lot of times we're using those words really without taking a deep dive into what they mean and why they're important. And so when we're talking about climate justice and when we're talking about gender justice in the paradigm of climate justice, the first and the foremost thing that we need to understand, again, what I'm going to say is not groundbreaking, it's something very basic. And that is that across the board during emergencies, inside of Pakistan and anywhere else in the world, in a disaster situation, in an emergency situation, we know, that there's, an Everest verse of data and evidence available to validate that women and girls are at the receiving end. Of course, affected populations across the board are vulnerable, but even within those vulnerable sections and segments, women and girls are the worst hit and the worst affected. Now, if we talk about Pakistan, and the case of my country, to sort of illustrate why girls and women are most affected, we know for a fact that there are several parts in the country, not spread all across Pakistan's landscape, but nonetheless a significant number of pockets in every province, in every nook and corner of the country, where women and girls, for instance, do not have as much mobility, and B, they don't have certain basic survival skills. Now, those survival skills could range from knowing how to swim, which we've seen repeatedly during flooding in Pakistan. That is one survival skill that perhaps Pakistanis should have, because floods obviously last year's floods were at a scale that was more devastating, but we've seen floods 12 years ago that also put 70% of the country underwater, right? So we know that this is something that's going to happen, but gender norms would just, frown upon girls learning how to swim. And then is it all right for them to just drown to death? And rather than giving them just the most basic of skills to survive. Similarly, because again, the pockets that I'm talking about in these sections of the country, women and girls have very, very limited exposure outside of their village or their hometown. And so during a disaster situation, when there's chaos, right, when all hell has broken loose, one has to know how to navigate and find their way somehow to safety. But for a person who's never perhaps, ventured very far, even within her own village or even within her own town, for her to be in that situation, quite honestly, I can't imagine it. And on top of the chaos and the disaster, to feel so entirely clueless and helpless. And then what adds to this again is the fact that we're all brought up with the understanding and the belief, and with the teaching that, men and women, if they're not tied through wedlock or blood, they must not interact. Now, I'm not going to go into the debate of right or wrong, or does it make sense or does it not make sense. My only concern is that in a society where more than 80% of the women would be extremely, extremely uncomfortable in the presence of a man, if that person were not sort of linked to them, tied to them through blood or wedlock, why must then the first responders who are going to rescue people from pull people outside, pull people from water or debris, why are they all men then? Why do we not? There is an acute absence of female first responders in the country. And so, regressive gender norms work both ways. On one side, they would not allow women to be as educated and as, active members of the workforce. And so we have no female first responders. We literally don't have any. And then on the other side, there's a whole population of women who are either not educated or marginally educated, and they don't have basic survival skills, and they don't have basic navigation skills, and there they are in the middle of a very, very chaotic situation, and they're thinking, should I drown or should I let that na mehram, that that random man actually touch me and pull me out? Why put people in that moral dilemma when they're anyways in the middle of life and death? So what I'm trying to say is, and why I felt it was important to go into this background is because we know for a fact, Pakistan being among the the top 10 countries in the world most affected by climate change, we know that dark and difficult times are ahead of us. We know for a fact that these floods were not an isolated occurring. We must embrace ourselves, all of us, for situations that, as Isbah pointed out, we've probably not experienced before, or situations that we've not anticipated. And so with this changed dynamic, there really is no space for whatever regressive norms we've been holding on to for far too long. We will have to very decisively, as a society, as a country, as a nation, once and for all, understand and then move swiftly towards somewhat of a radical change in how we perceive women and girls and their role, their general role in the public life. Also connected to the climate justice and the climate change debate. Now we understand, all right, I have 5 minutes left. Oh God, in my head, I had just started, but thank you for pointing that out. When we're talking about climate change and we're talking about climate justice, oh, thank you. All right, I will take those extra 2 minutes. I will take you up on that offer. When we're talking about these, we absolutely need to understand that even if there's not a large-scale disaster happening, climate change is impacting lives across Pakistan, as Farrah pointed out earlier. There are places, there are several places across the country that are steadily experiencing a deterioration in natural resources, most importantly, water. These are pushing communities to move out, to migrate into urban slums. Now, this climate-induced migration, again, has had a very devastating effect on women and girls. The most basic things, the most basic and most obvious impacts for young girls, for instance, would be a disruption or a complete discontinuation of their education, because the families they hail from are anyways very underserved, they're very marginalized. And on top of that, the cost of relocation, the cost of surviving in an urban center, these families can't, they cannot possibly prioritize education, and then education for a girl in a society where girls' education is anyways, at the bottom of the pyramid when it comes to household priorities, right? When we're talking, so I did have several things to say, but I will respect that we're a sort of, shorter time. What we as a country and all of us in this conversation as global citizens, what we need to understand is that we absolutely need more women at the decision-making table. So whether it's at the United Nations, whether it's at the at the national level, whether it's at the regional level, or even the most basic local level, we need more women on the decision-making table, because only women can truly anticipate and understand what women need. We can't continue to live in a world where you walk into a room and they're these suited gentlemen, all of them men, making important decisions about the lives of our lives. And that's not fair. I mean, if this were working, we would know that we wouldn't be facing really nonsensical issues in camp colonies. So, for instance, on top of displacement, one thing we saw 12 years ago when floods hit in 2010, 2012, 2011, the camp colonies, the most basic of things, right, is having a toilet. Now, the toilets were so far removed from the actual settlements that women would not take tea or water after 3 p.m. because they did not want to go. It was simply not safe for them to walk from their tent to the toilets. And so they absolutely stopped taking liquids well before dark. And we know of cases during that time when women just, during that walk from their tent to the toilet were either abducted, they faced violence, they were raped. And unless we have more women on the decision-making table, men cannot anticipate because men do not live with the vulnerabilities we live with. And so that is absolutely across the board the most important thing. Number two, when we're talking about climate action, right, another buzzword, 50% of the world's population comprises of our gender, of women and girls, right? Only 14% of ministers are women when it comes to climate change. And so women have a much smaller voice in climate action than men do. I do sort of feel grateful that Pakistan is among those 14% countries where a woman is leading climate action. We've seen how that woman has played Pakistan's case and the case of other countries affected by climate change at COP27 and at different other forums. We absolutely need more women at that level as well. Finally, when we're talking about, if we talk about very localized reforms, so Isbah pointed out that they need to be locally informed. We need to go back to indigenous knowledge, and there are no two opinions about that. That's extremely, extremely important. At the same time, what we do need to be mindful, and not just us, but then so many donors who have contributed, although, as all of you pointed out, we see a very clear donor fatigue right now. Of course, the pandemic has had an effect. The global recession is playing a part in all of this. But there is a very obvious donor fatigue, and the sort of support that Pakistan needs has somehow not poured in. But nonetheless, whatever support that has come, that support should not just blindly, that money should not just blindly be spent. We need to understand that while our priorities, while our developmental designs, they do need to be informed locally, they also need to treat away from regressive norms. And sort of have, gender lens is, I think, such a cliched word to use, but for lack of a better word, everything absolutely needs to be viewed from that lens. Whatever X framework is made, how does it factor in women? How will it impact women? How will it benefit or not benefit women? All of these questions need to be answered before a policy or a framework or a way forward is chalked out or finalized. At the local level, we need to quite seriously start thinking about including climate action, climate justice, climate change in our curriculum, and taking that education actually to the communities that are most likely to be affected, even inside of Pakistan, right? At this point, for me, I think the most problematic thing is that given that, we were already hosting one of the biggest populations of out-of-school children in the world, yes, I'm wrapping up, in the world, we've just, I mean, because of the floods, millions of more children who were going to schools earlier are now out of schools, right? And we can possibly not combat climate change with a population that is uneducated, that is unaware, that is ill-prepared, that doesn't even understand what climate change is. And so, yeah, so I mean, I feel, you know, whatever I've said is not something that all of you did not know about already, but I just felt it was important to emphasize and sort of hammer, you know, whoever might listen, and if it makes sense, to just point these things out. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Areebah. Such important points. I want to thank you, Areebah, Farrah, and Isbah, for touching upon all these really important, critical areas reflected related to the floods and giving us a much more multifaceted understanding. I know there's a question in the Q&A from Maria touching upon, Areebah, what you've been speaking about with regards to the disproportionate impacts of disasters such as floods on women and girls, and whether, you know, that is more magnified in the context of Pakistan because of gender norms. Farrah would like to also contribute to that question, and then I'll also go to Isbah, who would also like to contribute to that. So please go ahead, Farrah.
Thank you. I just wanted to highlight that, yes, due to the gender norms in Pakistan, cultural and gender norms in Pakistan, it is much more pronounced, the difference and the differential treatment and differential impact of various disasters on women. And Areebah has already mentioned quite a number of examples that how women become more vulnerable also. So what I wanted to highlight was also one of the other aspects is that many of the factors actually become together, like, for example, certain geographies. In those geographies, women would be more vulnerable and more impacted as compared to certain other geographies. So just wanted to highlight this point as well. And since this question also talks about this marginalization of women, of course, low education from the birth, low importance in terms of the family member. Then, of course, when it is low importance to a girl's birth, then in every field that continues to, of course, things are changing in Pakistan, but they haven't changed to an extent where we say that, you know, women have become at par. Probably nowhere in the world women would have become at par. Perhaps a few countries may have a wonderful gender index, equality index, but most of the countries in Asia at least have this problem. And it is far from, you know, reaching that level where we can say that, yes, we have progressed to a great extent. That I don't know when that will come, but a lot of struggle over years I have seen, and a lot of change also I have observed. So perhaps it is a matter of more opportunities of education, not only for girls and women, but also for men and boys, and all that exposure that is required for them to appreciate that their sisters or their, you know, other relatives or cousins or who are girls and women, they also have a lot of talent that needs to be appreciated and that needs to be polished. So it will not only happen by providing opportunities to women and girls, but also by providing opportunities to men and boys to be able to see that and not be threatened by the development of women, and kind of support that whole process so that the whole country gets developed, not just, you know, one gender vis-a-vis the other, or certain geographical areas vis-a-vis the other. So it's a lot of struggle in terms of equity and equality in this country that people have been going through. Social movements, the political movements, women's movement. So everybody has tried that. So I would say that yes, it is still there is still a long way to go. However, there has been examples where people have come out of their situation. So we do keep our hopes high that there would be sometimes there would be situation would be much better than what it is now.
Thank you so much, Farrah. Isbah, I'll let you speak also to this issue, and also Isbah, if you'd like to, you can take the questions. There's 2 questions for you also in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Areebah and Farrah, for such wonderful presentations. I would just like to add one thing to what Areebah has said when she was talking about how swimming is not being considered. So I was just thinking that in Netherlands, there was I just want to quote one example to see how priorities are being set in the other nations. In Netherlands, they had a flood in 1950s, and from then till now, they have made swimming mandatory for each and every child that goes to school. So this is how the priorities are set. I mean, we in Pakistan experience floods almost every 2 years, if we look at the probability, if we look at the intensity. So, and till, I mean, we are unable to have an appropriate policy, let aside swimming, let aside gender, we can't have an emergency response in place, an effective emergency response in place. So I just wanted to add one thing to see, to make it highlight that how the other nations are making their priorities right and appropriate. Coming to the questions in the chat box, one of the questions that I would like to answer is that I think it was related to me. What is the role of urbanization on rural floods? First, if we look at the scale of this recent disaster in 2022, it wasn't by any means, it wasn't a rural flood only. What we have seen is that we have seen rural areas submerged. We have seen the rural urban center peripheries submerged. And, you know, there was just one part of Punjab that was left saved from the floods inundation. Otherwise, all of the other areas were they were submerged under water. So when we say what is the role of urbanization, it means that some of the policies or some of the steps or measures that we have taken in order to develop is we have over-occupied the sensitively ecological marginalized areas. We have occupied the riverine plains. The marginalized populations have already occupied the riverine plains. So the pathway of the flood route is being over-occupied by some of the communities. Even if we look at the northern part of the country, what we have seen in the upper part, northern part, we have seen that so many riverways are there are some hotels, there are some plazas that are being built alongside the river pathways. So, I mean, the river flows vary on daily basis. It is not a simple set of molecules that will flow from that pathway every time. So it keeps on changing. But what the wrong policies of the urbanization or the developmental policies are playing their part in devastating devastating role that they are playing is that they have overburdened those regions by making communities over there. And as Farrah has said, that we have made urbanization, that we have converted the communities, the rural areas, the peri-urban areas into the housing societies. And what is it doing? It is not only creating a food insecurity for the country, but it is also making difficult for the natural ecological processes to work on it efficiently. And the floods or the river or the waters, when they come beyond limits, they can't find ways to go anywhere. So they just rush in wherever they find some places. So this is how the urbanization is playing their role in making floods massively disastrous. And the other point, I will just quickly go over that. Since floods cause food insecurity, water scarcity, loss of life due to mismanagement of the disaster, what are the adaptation recommendations in your opinion besides changes in policies? Thank you, Sarah, for your question, but I think food insecurity, water scarcity, and all of these damages are being ensued from policies. Your policies decide what kind of food secure or food insecurity your nation is going to be. Your policies decide how water secure and insecure your nation is going to be. So it's not only about the monetarily management of the disaster or the mismanagement of the disaster, but it also depends upon the long-term policies that the nation has prioritized in order to develop in general and in order to respond to disasters in particular. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Isbah. I just want to put one final question to Areebah before we close. There's a message in the Q&A from Arid who asks, Areebah, what needs to be done to get more women into leadership positions?
Thank you. I guess, again, the answer to this is very simple. And I did sort of touch upon it while I was speaking. See, PARC, when we look at the number of out-of-school girls in Pakistan, it is overwhelming. So of all the out-of-school children in the country, which before the pandemic and before the floods stood at 22.8 million, right? 53% of these out-of-school children were girls. And while, you know, data is still emerging in terms of the impact the pandemic had, we don't have very credible data post-floods right now. We have reason to believe that the number of out-of-school girls is just going to accentuate in the coming years. The problem over here is that even among the girls who do end up in schools or are literate, only 14% of them will ever complete 10th grade, and a much smaller percentage from them will ever make it to higher education and, you know, sort of walk into a university. We can't have women in leadership roles unless they are educated, right? And so I guess when we're talking about becoming a shock resilient country and disaster resilient country, we cannot discount the integral role that education should have played and will play, the life-saving role that education has in terms of Pakistan's ability to withstand coming disasters. And so when we're talking about pushing women into leadership roles, we first need to push more girls nicely, politely into schools.
Thank you so much, Areebah, Isbah, and Farrah. I know we could go on, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of the questions in the Q&A, and it is very late in the evening for both Farrah and Areebah. Really, thank you so much for coming and sharing your experiences and thoughts about this very, very important issue. This recording, I've put the link in the chat for attendees, will be on the university's website for the Peace and Reconciliation Center. I'd like to thank Ian Rockbridge and Alicia Tournier for all your help to organize this event. I'd also like to thank the staff at UFV's Research Office and College of Arts, as well as the Peace and Reconciliation Center for their support for this event. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.